Thank you. So thank you, Charlene. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today. So Professor Emily Baum is Associate Professor of History at UC Irvine. She's also the Director of Long U.S.-China Institute at UC Irvine. Her research focuses on history of medicine and psychiatry in modern China, also comparative medical history, as well as popular religion. Professor Baum got her PhD degree from UC San Diego in 2013. She is very prolific, has published many articles in very important journals, interesting journals also. For example, Journal of the History of the Behavioral Sciences, History of Psychiatry, Bulletin of the History of Medicine, Journal of the History of the this is the one I just said. So a lot of interesting articles, but her most important achievement so far is her single-authored monograph titled The Invention of Madness, State, Society, and the Insane in Modern China. It was published by University of Chicago Press in 2018, and it was shortlisted for International Convention of Asia Scholars 2021 Book Prize. This is a beautifully written and deeply researched book. I highly recommend. This book traces the genealogy of insanity from the turn of the century to about the onset of a war with Japan in 1937. So this book really unpacks the complex ways in which madness was transformed in the Chinese imagination into mental illness. So for those of you who are interested in medical history, psychiatry, it will be a great read for you. And also she co-edited with Professor Howard Zhang, who is also here, a special issue for the Journal of the History of the Behavioral Sciences. The special issue is called What Does a View from East Asia Add to the Critical Study of Mental Health? And I had the pleasure of contributing an article to that special issue. So it was really wonderful to work with both of them. So today, I believe Professor Baum is going to talk about her current research. So I will now turn to you, Emily. So welcome, let's welcome, virtual welcome.
Well, thank you so much, Leah, for that really wonderful introduction. Thanks to Xiaoling and Megan for organizing this. It's great to see Howard and other familiar faces. I wish I could be at UC Davis in person, but this will have to do for now until I can see all of you again. Okay, so let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay. So today I'm going to be talking about my new book project, and this is actually a very new project. I actually only started doing research for it after COVID hit, largely by necessity, because like everyone else, I couldn't get into China, so I had to sort of rethink my my research plans. So I'm very much looking forward to getting your feedback, getting your questions. This is a project that is still very much in the developmental phase, so I am very interested to hear what you have to think. Have to say about it. So this new project, which will hopefully become my second book, examines the history of acupuncture as it circulated from China to the United States beginning in the early 1970s. And it's really centered on one key question. And that question is, how and by what process was acupuncture transformed from a basically unknown medical modality in the United States in the first half of the 20th century into one of the most popular forms of complementary and alternative medical practice by the end of the century? And my answer to this question is that it's really impossible to understand the rise of acupuncture within American medicine if we don't place the practice into a global context. And so more specifically, I argue that Chinese ideas, actors, and political developments were really crucial to popularizing acupuncture abroad, causing it to become an object of major fascination within the United States starting in the early 1970s. And so, as I'll show in my talk today, many of the early intellectual and diplomatic exchanges that occurred between the United States and China sort of hinged on the exchange of medical and scientific knowledge, and acupuncture was really at the center of that. And so, in many ways, acupuncture served as more than just a medical modality. It also served as a diplomatic tool. And therefore, we can't really understand the rise of acupuncture within American medicine if we don't also take into consideration this broader diplomatic context. Now, why is this important? Why should we care about the role that China played in the popularization of American acupuncture? Well, in making this argument, I really see myself as making contributions to the fields of both the global history of medicine and the history of China. So on the one hand, when historians have researched the history of alternative medicine in the 20th century United States, they've tended to really view this history from a predominantly domestic lens. And this isn't necessarily the case for earlier time periods, but I'm really just focused on the 20th century here. So James Wharton in his book, Nature Cures, or Hans Baer's work on alternative healing systems, I mean, these scholars have all tended to explain the trajectory of alternative medicine in the United States as a strictly American phenomenon. So when it comes to the case of acupuncture more specifically, historians have tended to attribute the rise of acupuncture to factors like popular dissatisfaction with establishment medicine, skepticism of the medical industrial complex, and the Vietnam War, which caused many Americans to sort of turn their attention to Asia. None of these authors, however, have tried to place the history of alternative medicine in a sort of transnational framework. And so instead, the way they talk about acupuncture is like Americans sort of just spontaneously discovered it in the midst of a counterculture fascination with the exotic East. Now, on the other hand, when historians have studied the history of medicine in 20th century China, we've tended, by and large, to focus on the one-directional transmission of medical ideas from West to East, although this is now starting to change. Historians like Sean Lay and his book, Neither Donkey Nor Horse, Ruth Rogaski has a very famous book called Hygienic Modernity, and myself, I consider myself among the same group of scholars. We've all sort of studied how biomedical ideas from Europe and the United States fundamentally transformed what we think of today as traditional Chinese medicine. Now, by contrast, and what I want to do in this project, is I want to show that China, was not just a recipient of medical knowledge from the West, but that it was also a producer of medical knowledge. And this knowledge could circulate far beyond its own national borders to influence practices and knowledge regimes as far away as the Western world. In the case of acupuncture, the Chinese government deliberately marketed the practice to the American public as a diplomatic tool and as a form of soft power. And in the process, they ended up shaping American medical practices and ideas about health in certain indelible ways. So in order to illustrate this argument, in my talk today, I'm going to zoom in on one key moment in the book. And that moment is a moment in the early 1970s when acupuncture suddenly bursts into the American consciousness as a new medical modality. So prior to the 1970s, acupuncture really wasn't a very well-known practice in the United States, if it was even known at all. As historians like Tamara Bennett-Shelton have shown, Chinese medicine doctors had long existed in the US, but they didn't tend to practice acupuncture per se. They primarily practiced things like herbal therapies and pulsology. And the reason that they didn't practice acupuncture was twofold. So on the one hand, back in China, acupuncture had long had a reputation for being a sort of lowbrow or unskilled practice. The most elite and the most literate physicians sort of thought it was a sign that you were a kind of crude or unlearned practitioner if you treated people by means of physical interventions like needling. And so what this meant was that most of the people who used acupuncture as a treatment modality back in China were often lower class, illiterate, or itinerant healers. And so physicians in the United States, by and large, tended to avoid it. Now, the other reason that acupuncture had never gained much popularity in the US had a lot to do with American sensibilities. Most patients who visited Chinese medicine doctors did so because they were trying to avoid invasive operations. They believed that Chinese herbal therapies could cure them in a way that would enable them to bypass things like surgery and needles. And so it would have been somewhat counterproductive for an American patient to visit a Chinese healer if they were just going to have to undergo a needling operation anyway. Now, this wasn't necessarily the case in other parts of the world. Acupuncture had long been known to European patients and physicians since at least the early modern period. The Dutch physician Willem ten Rijn had published a text on acupuncture as early as the 17th century. In Germany, the physician Engelbert Kempfer, who traveled to Japan alongside the Dutch East India Company and learned about acupuncture there, he published a text on acupuncture and moxibustion in the 18th century, and this is an image from his text. And in France, acupuncture had been extremely popular and something of a medical fad since at least the 19th century. The physician Louis Berlioz, who also happened to be the father of the composer Hector Berlioz, wrote extensively about the benefits of acupuncture, and he promoted the practice quite widely. And in the 1930s, the French diplomat Georges Soulier de Mauran, who happened to be living in Beijing and briefly studied acupuncture there, he writes this landmark text in 1938 about all of the different uses of acupuncture. This is just an excerpt from his book. The French says, "What can acupuncture cure?" And it goes on to list all of these different things that acupuncture can cure. And this text becomes sort of a benchmark for later French language texts on the topic. So acupuncture had been widely known throughout Europe. However, it had never really captured the attention of American patients and consumers. And as a result, by the 1970s, most Americans had never even heard the word acupuncture, let alone considered going to a practitioner of Chinese medicine for needling therapy. And as a sort of interesting point of fact, when Henry Kissinger goes to China in 1971, he writes this memorandum back to President Nixon in which he literally has to define what acupuncture was. So this all changes very quickly in the early 1970s when acupuncture suddenly bursts into the American consciousness. Now, at the time, China and the United States had basically had no diplomatic or people-to-people exchanges for close to a quarter of a century. Ever since the Chinese Communist Party had risen to power in 1949, and ever since China and the United States had found themselves pitted against one another during the Korean War, no direct diplomatic visits had taken place between the two countries. Starting in 1971, however, Mao Zedong, chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, starts to give the signal that he's potentially open to the possibility of working with the Americans. This was the time of the Sino-Soviet split, when Chinese-Russian relations were very strained. And so Mao and the Chinese premier Zhou Enlai begin to set in motion the tentative start of a diplomatic rapprochement, which eventually would culminate in President Richard Nixon's trip to China in February of 1972, almost exactly 50 years ago. Well, acupuncture, somewhat surprisingly, played a very key role in this rapprochement. Well, in most histories that talk about the genesis of acupuncture in the United States, they tend to begin and end with this guy, James Reston. So James Reston was a journalist for the New York Times. And in 1971, he was in Beijing to report on Henry Kissinger's secret diplomatic visit to China when he happened to suffer a burst appendix. Well, Reston undergoes an emergency appendectomy, and afterward, he agrees to be treated with acupuncture to manage his post-operative pain, which is what this image is showing. He eventually recovers, and when he does, he writes about his experiences with acupuncture in the New York Times. He later goes on the CBS Evening News. This is while he was still in Japan and en route back to the United States, where he talks about the successful procedure that he underwent. And when he gets back to the United States, he was just inundated with letters from readers and viewers asking where they could find an acupuncturist, either locally or even in China. Well, in histories of American acupuncture, this is where the story both begins and ends, with James Reston, as if Reston had suddenly just discovered acupuncture for himself. But what I'd like to suggest is that Reston's experience was, in many ways, simply the outward manifestation of a process that the Chinese government had already set in motion behind the scenes, at least several years before Reston had even stepped foot in Beijing. And that process was spurred by the invention of something called acupuncture anesthesia. So what was acupuncture anesthesia? Well, acupuncture anesthesia was first discovered around the year 1958, but it wasn't really used on a wide basis until the late 1960s and early 1970s. And the procedure is exactly what it sounds like. It was the use of acupuncture either in place of or as an adjunct to medicinal anesthetics during surgery. Now, more accurately, the procedure should probably be referred to as acupuncture analgesia because it didn't dull all sensations. It simply eliminated the pain associated with surgical procedures. So the way that it worked was that approximately 30 minutes before the start of surgery, an acupuncturist would insert one or more needles into several strategic acupoints. Then they would rotate the needles either by hand or sometimes they would hook them up to an electrical generator, which is what you can see in the picture here. After about 30 minutes, the patient would signal to the acupuncturist that they had de qi, that they had obtained qi. And this was an indication that their senses had been dulled and that the surgery could proceed. Well, acupuncture anesthesia was used for all types of procedures, including things as invasive as pulmonary lobectomies, this is removing parts of your lung, brain surgeries, tonsillectomies, and cesarean sections. And it was widely touted by the Chinese government as superior to conventional anesthetics because it reduced the risk of surgical complications. It wasn't addictive like morphine. And it also embodied certain Maoist principles. Because the patient remained awake throughout the entirety of the procedure, they could communicate with the surgeon, they could tell them how they were feeling, and therefore they could actively participate in the success of the surgery. So this was a way of sort of equalizing the status between the doctor and the patient, which was very important within Maoist ideology. Well, upon verifying the effectiveness of the technique, the Chinese Communist Party quickly realized that acupuncture anesthesia could serve as more than just a medical procedure. It could also serve as a diplomatic tool, or what I refer to as needle diplomacy. As early as the spring of 1971, this is several months before James Reston had undergone his procedure in Beijing, the Chinese government had already started to invite a few select Americans into the country with the intent of showing off the gains that they had made in medical and scientific development under the leadership of Mao Zedong. So two of the first Americans to secure a visa into the country were the biologists Ethan Signer and Arthur Galston. Signer and Galston were vocal opponents of the war in Vietnam, and they had been planning to visit Hanoi on a lecture tour when they decided, kind of spur of the moment, to file an application for a Chinese visa. Well, much to their surprise, their visa was granted and they became the first American scientists to enter the country since 1949. Well, Signer and Galston were plant biologists. And so it was somewhat to their confusion that their Chinese hosts insisted that they be brought to several hospitals where they were introduced to this procedure of acupuncture anesthesia. As part of their tour, they witnessed 4 major operations performed under acupuncture anesthesia, including things like the excision of a thyroid tumor and the removal of an ovarian cyst, which is what you can see in both of these images here. When they returned to the United States, they wrote in both scientific and popular venues like the Boston Globe, and this essentially led to a media firestorm about the procedure. Well, Signer and Galston were just the first of what was to become a steady stream of American physicians, diplomats, and scientists, including people in President Nixon's entourage, such as his own personal physician, Walter Tkach, who would travel to China and be taken into operating rooms to watch these procedures live and in person. Now, a lot of these people, like Signer and Galston, were initially confused about why they had been brought into a hospital as part of their Chinese tour. But what they didn't understand is that the reason these surgeries were becoming centerpieces of all of these visits was because the Chinese government was deliberately using acupuncture anesthesia as a way to highlight the achievements of Chinese communism, to propagandize the success of Mao Zedong thought, and to galvanize further foreign interest in Chinese accomplishments in science and medicine. In other words, they were using acupuncture as a diplomatic tool. Now, the Chinese were quite explicit about their use of acupuncture for diplomatic purposes. Starting in 1971, the Chinese Ministry of Health circulated a number of confidential documents to local public health bureaus, and these documents directly stated that acupuncture anesthesia was, quote, extremely important political work that should be broadly propagandized both domestically and internationally. When foreigners came to China, they wrote, acupuncture anesthesia could serve as, quote, an exceedingly good opportunity to propagandize Mao Zedong thought and to showcase Mao's revolutionary line in foreign diplomacy. So in other words, the CCP wasn't just thinking about acupuncture as a type of medical treatment. They were thinking about it as a convenient way to propagandize Chinese accomplishments and to possibly even export Chinese communism abroad. The Ministry of Health specifically noted in its messages to local public health bureaus that all propaganda and educational materials that were to be made about the technique were supposed to reflect the ideology of revolutionary Maoism. Films were supposed to feature medical personnel reading and discussing Mao's texts. Images were supposed to show patients clutching the little red book of Maoist quotations, as we can see here. And charts were supposed to show an uptick in the use of the procedure since the launch of the Cultural Revolution in 1966. So this was a deliberate diplomatic strategy. And beginning in the early 1970s, a central part of every diplomatic, cultural, and people-to-people exchange between China and the United States involved acupuncture anesthesia. Even Henry Kissinger was taken on a tour of a Beijing hospital where he was made to observe 3 surgical operations under acupuncture. Now, Kissinger himself was somewhat perplexed as to why someone who was not a medical doctor would have been forced into an operating room. But what Kissinger didn't understand was that these very performative displays of acupuncture anesthesia, or what I'm kind of cheekily referring to as surgical theater, these were staged and scripted events that the Chinese Communist Party deliberately used as tools of soft power and as a way for the Chinese government to showcase the advances that they had made in medical science under the leadership of Mao Zedong. And it worked. Americans just ate it up. When Nixon goes to China in February of 1972, he was accompanied by a whole convention of news reporters and film crews. And one of the principal topics that they broadcast back to American viewers was acupuncture anesthesia. So on the evening of February 25th, 1972, for example, ABC, CBS, and NBC each broadcast competing exposés from the No. 3 hospital in Beijing, where they had been permitted or perhaps even encouraged to take footage of 4 simultaneous surgical operations that were being performed under acupuncture anesthesia. I'm going to show one of these clips. It's about 1.5 minutes long, but it'll give you a sense of the way that acupuncture anesthesia was being introduced to American audiences as this miraculous communist discovery and this incredible antidote to pain. So this is Ted Koppel's segment on ABC's Nightly News, and I'm going to play it, and hopefully the sound works, but let me know if it doesn't work.
The thought of any operation is enough to unnerve most of us, but directly behind me is a 45-year-old woman who is about to undergo an operation while fully conscious and without the benefit of anesthesia. The woman is a school teacher. On her neck, as you can see, is an egg-sized thyroid growth. Inserted into either side of her neck, 2 small acupuncture needles. They will not deaden the feeling in her neck altogether, but they will deaden the pain. Most of the time, the needles are manipulated by hand, but they can also, as in this case, be vibrated by a small electronic device. After having the needles in her neck for 20 minutes, the patient is ready. From this point on, surgery proceeds as it might in an American operating theater, but throughout, the patient is wide awake. and nurses lean over and talk with her periodically to see if she's comfortable. A good selection of operations are in progress simultaneously. Next door, a young man lies munching on orange sections while surgeons remove part of one of his lungs. The only pain-killing device used in this lobectomy is one acupuncture needle in the patient's right forearm. The needle is manipulated by hand. American newsmen wander freely from one operating theater to the next. The removal of the thyroid growth takes about an hour. At the end of the operation, the woman sits up, is helped into her robe, and off the operating table. As she walks out of the operating theater and down the hall, a nurse whispers to her. She turns to the camera and waves. This is Ted Koppel, ABC News, at the No. 3 hospital in Peking.
Right, so we can see that this was a spectacle. It was a performative event. And for a couple of years, it was basically all anyone in the United States could write about. There's a physician named Frank Warren who makes this sort of sarcastic comment that he wasn't entirely certain about the types of things that acupuncture could cure, but what he could say with certainty is that it could cure writer's block. In the world of print media, hundreds, if not thousands, of news reports began to be churned out in outlets ranging from Newsweek and Reader's Digest to the Boston Globe and the New York Times, all of which noted with a mixture of admiration and awe how the seemingly inexplicable act of twirling a single needle was able to produce enough pain relief to proceed with a highly invasive surgery. And we can see again how these procedures are rehearsed acts, right? The patients are smiling, they ask to see the growths that have been cut out of them, they are drinking tea and communicating with their American observers, right? This is very theatrical. Acupuncture even made its way into primetime television. The NBC show The Bold Ones, starring Carl Reiner, devoted an entire episode to acupuncture, and the episode was sarcastically titled A Nation of Human Pincushions. Well, by the spring of 1972, there had been so many reports about acupuncture anesthesia and so much fascination with how or if the procedure worked that American physicians decided to conduct their own experiments in order to verify that this wasn't just some communist hoax. Indeed, despite the fact that mostly everyone who had witnessed the procedure back in China was more or less convinced that it was effective, physicians back in the States remained skeptical. Many of them suspected that perhaps the procedure only worked in the context of Maoist China because patients had been so brainwashed to believe in the power of Mao Zedong thought that they wouldn't even realize that they were feeling pain. Others thought that maybe the patients were actually feeling pain, but that they were so scared of being punished by the Chinese Communist Party that they wouldn't dare show it. The only way to find out for certain was to test the technique within the United States, and so that's what several physicians set out to do. Well, the first successful use of acupuncture anesthesia on an American patient occurred in May 1972, when a Chicago-based anesthesiologist named Wei-Chu Liu used acupuncture as the only anesthetic during a tonsillectomy. From that time on, other physicians tried the technique on everything ranging from dental extractions to skin grafts, abortions to hernia removals, cesarean sections to breast augmentations. To be sure, these operations were not always 100% successful, and some patients had to be switched to medicinal anesthetics partway through. But by and large, a lot of the evidence suggested, and patient testimonials concurred, like this one by Gary Chin right here, who underwent a tonsillectomy. But it seemed to suggest that acupuncture actually did kind of work as a way to either relieve pain or prevent pain from occurring in the first place. Well, one of the major consequences of this propaganda coup was that more and more Americans suddenly became fascinated with Maoist China and the other potentially transformative discoveries that up until this point had remained hidden behind the so-called bamboo curtain. Physicians who had gained entry into the country, and even Pat Nixon, the first lady, were deluged with letters and phone calls from desperate individuals who wanted to know how they too could obtain a visa so that they could travel to China and see an authentic acupuncturist in person. Among the American scientific community as well, physicians, biologists, and healthcare workers scrambled to figure out how they could become the next group of lucky individuals invited into the country. If the goal of the Chinese Communist Party had been to galvanize American interest in the PRC, then the stunt with acupuncture anesthesia had clearly worked. Now, the use of acupuncture for diplomatic purposes cut in both directions. It wasn't just the Chinese who were using acupuncture in order to sort of lubricate the channels between China and the United States. Among Americans as well, acupuncture became a convenient and seemingly apolitical way to gain closer ties with their Chinese counterparts. For members of the American scientific community who were able to secure a highly coveted invitation into the PRC, they recognized that they weren't just going to China to undertake an investigation into new medical technologies like acupuncture. They were also going as diplomatic agents, and they were highly aware of this responsibility. Well, one of the groups leading the charge to gain entry into the PRC was an organization called the Committee on Scholarly Communication with the People's Republic of China. The Committee on Scholarly Communication was an independent organization founded in 1966 with support from the American Council of Learned Societies, the Social Science Research Council, and the National Academy of Sciences. In the summer of 1972, the committee had the chance to spend 1 month in China, where they were hosted by Guo Ruo, the president of the Chinese Academy of Sciences, and Zhou Peiyuan, who is the vice chairman of the Scientific and Technical Association. The committee had a heightened awareness that they were serving in both a research and a diplomatic capacity. While they were in China, one of their main objectives was to negotiate with their hosts for further people-to-people exchanges that would run in both directions. They negotiated for 12 American delegations to travel to China over the next 2 years. And in return, they also received assurance from the Chinese government that the same number of Chinese delegations would be able to visit the United States during the same period. Well, as part of these negotiations, both sides agreed that the members of their respective delegations would be chosen not strictly on the basis of their scholarly merit, but also on the basis of their diplomatic merit. In other words, they were supposed to be representatives of their respective countries. So Harrison Brown, one of the members of the committee, wrote in Science magazine that, quote, "The selection of individuals will be based on scholarly merit, representation in the field, maturity, and diplomacy." And the Chinese, for their part, were equally insistent that scholars travel to both countries not as individuals, but rather as members of national delegations. These were supposed to be groups that would represent the ideas and interests of their home nations and therefore serve as informal diplomatic agents. Even President Nixon saw the power of acupuncture as a way to ease Cold War tensions between the two countries and find a site of common ground. In one of his taped conversations from the Oval Office that I got from the Nixon Library, he bluntly states that although China and the United States clearly had two very different political systems, he says, quote, "One of the ways we can cooperate is on the disease thing. When it came to disease and taking care of people, they felt the same as we did." In other words, acupuncture could serve as a point of common humanity and a site of cooperation, even in the face of overt political difference. In another taped conversation, Nixon was also forthright about how great advances in medicine and public health could just as easily come from the Chinese side as it could from the American side. And so what this meant for him was that he and his government should work as hard as possible to break down all of the barriers preventing medical and scientific exchange. And one of the ways that he could do so was by sending American physicians to China to learn acupuncture and to bring Chinese acupuncturists back to the Western world. Well, if the Chinese Communist Party had simply wanted to heighten American interest in Chinese innovations, then their use of needle diplomacy had certainly achieved its objective. The problem, however, was that it had only worked in a limited capacity. So as I had mentioned earlier in the talk, one of the reasons acupuncture anesthesia was being so widely glorified by the Chinese Communist Party was because it embodied so many facets of Maoist ideology. It was cheap and widely accessible, even in rural areas, so you didn't need a ton of money, you didn't even necessarily need electricity in order to use it. It was easily mastered, so you didn't have to spend years and years in medical school like you did in the capitalist West. And it also facilitated an equalization of the relationship between the doctor and the patient, right? Patients were encouraged to communicate with the surgeon, give them constant feedback, which they could do because they hadn't been fully anesthetized. So for the CCP, they were thinking about acupuncture anesthesia not strictly as a technical operation, but more importantly as a vessel through which they could export Mao Zedong thought and the Maoist model of health delivery to the United States. Now, the problem was that, with only limited exceptions, most Americans were only interested in acupuncture as a standalone technique. They couldn't care less about Maoism. And in fact, for many physicians, they believed that the very presence of things like the Little Red Book served to discredit the procedure rather than bolster it. This was the very reason that they had felt compelled to undertake their own investigations into the technique in the first place, because either they weren't convinced that it worked, they thought perhaps the whole thing was just this elaborate stunt driven by the Chinese Ministry of Health, or they thought that it could never work in an American context where patients hadn't been deluded or brainwashed by Maoist ideology. Now, to be sure, there were certain individuals in the United States who were convinced by Maoism, and they spoke passionately about the need to implement the Maoist medical model more widely within the United States. So for example, the physician Gray Diamond, who was one of the first doctors to gain entry into the PRC in 1971, he published a book in 1975 in which he argued that China offered more than just herbs and acupuncture. In other words, that Americans shouldn't just focus on the technical aspects of acupuncture as separate from its Maoist foundations, but instead that they should take Chinese innovations in healthcare and health delivery seriously. Similarly, the public health specialist Victor Siddell, who also gained entry into the PRC in 1971, he later published a book with his wife Ruth titled Serve the People, in which he argued that a focus on acupuncture itself was missing the point. The bigger point, he said, was that acupuncture would never be successful if it weren't accompanied by a broader restructuring of the American healthcare system, one that would be more in line with Maoist principles of service, accessibility, and equality between the patient and the physician. And perhaps most notably, the Black Panther Party and the Young Lords experimented with acupuncture treatment for drug detox at a New York hospital called Lincoln Detox, and they spoke quite explicitly about how they were trying to emulate the Maoist model of barefoot doctors in their interactions with the local Bronx community. So there were a few individuals who advocated for the adoption of a Maoist medical system. But on the whole, these people were sort of few and far between. Much more commonly, American physicians, diplomats, and members of scientific delegations viewed acupuncture as strictly an isolated technical development, one that could be used regardless of the Maoist context in which it had been discovered. Well, despite Americans' reluctance to absorb Maoist ideology alongside acupuncture treatment, in the end, whether or not they were persuaded by Maoism didn't really make much of a difference. Acupuncture continued to be integrated into the American medical system, and eventually in China as well, the Maoist rationale behind acupuncture and acupuncture anesthesia was gradually eliminated. So following the death of Mao Zedong in 1976, and with the turn to reform and opening that took place under Deng Xiaoping in the 1980s and 1990s, Maoism was quickly cast aside insofar as it related to Chinese medicine. Instead, acupuncture in China was reduced to a standalone medical technology rather than a symbol of a broader political ideology. In many ways, though, the elimination of Maoism from acupuncture meant that it was much easier for the Chinese government to use acupuncture as a diplomatic tool. The Chinese Ministry of Health was no longer hamstrung by the awkward use of Maoist slogans, and they could simply promote acupuncture for its curative benefits, which is something that Americans were all too keen to accept. And so following the end of the Cultural Revolution and following the turn to reform and opening, needle diplomacy didn't stall out. If anything, it actually picked up steam. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, the Chinese Ministry of Health convened an increasing number of international conferences, workshops, and research institutes with the stated intent of bringing foreigners to China to learn acupuncture directly from Chinese experts. Acupuncture colleges and training schools were opened in Beijing, Shanghai, and Nanjing, where they solicited applications from foreign students and trained them in acupuncture in the English language. And international research symposia brought together Chinese masters with American and European physicians, where they could jointly study the physiological mechanism behind acupuncture's effectiveness. The combined result of all of these efforts was that more and more Americans were being trained in acupuncture techniques, and more scientists were being introduced to acupuncture as a treatment modality, which they then brought back with them to the United States and lobbied for the legal right to practice. Throughout this process, the Chinese government knew exactly what was going on and worked to perpetuate the acupuncture craze on a larger and larger scale. In both confidential and publicly circulating reports, the Chinese Ministry of Health closely monitored developments in acupuncture research, both at home and overseas, proudly proclaiming that acupuncture had entered the world and that acupuncture anesthesia had attracted the world's attention and recognition. For China, acupuncture had achieved its objective: to draw positive attention to the PRC, to showcase Chinese innovations in medicine, and to reopen engagement with the Western world, at least partly on Chinese terms. Needle diplomacy, in other words, had very much achieved its goal, even if it wasn't exactly the same goal that Mao Zedong had initially intended back in the early 1970s. So all told, it's really impossible to understand the history of acupuncture in the United States if we don't consider the role that China played in this process. Starting in 1971, the Chinese government deliberately promoted acupuncture anesthesia as a revolutionary new medical modality, one that was able to attract American attention because of its spectacular theatrical qualities, right? It wasn't just surgery, it was surgical theater. Throughout the 1970s, acupuncture became a pivot of people-to-people exchange because, by and large, Americans interpreted it as an apolitical way to collaborate on an area of common concern: medical and public health, even if this wasn't necessarily how the Maoist regime had intended it to be understood. And even after the death of Mao Zedong, the Chinese government continued to use acupuncture as a way to encourage foreigners to study and train in China so that they could then bring the modality back home with them where they could practice it locally. In other words, acupuncture wasn't spontaneously discovered by the American people in the midst of a counterculture fascination with Asia. Instead, it was deliberately sold to them by the Chinese government as both a medical and a diplomatic tool. In the process, acupuncture became increasingly incorporated into American medical practice, eventually gaining official recognition from the National Institutes of Health in 1997, and quickly becoming the most sought-after form of alternative medicine within American healthcare. By placing this history into a global perspective, then, it becomes possible to retrieve Chinese agency in a narrative from which China has previously been erased. And so I will end there, but I am looking forward to hearing your comments, your questions, suggestions, anything that you care to share with me. But thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Emily. This is so wonderful. Very enlightening. I've learned so much. Gosh, a lot of things I didn't know. So I encourage people to raise their virtual hands and ask questions directly rather than writing in the chat, because then I have to read the chat to other people. So feel free to raise your hand and just ask the question directly. So yeah, we'll turn to Eddie first.
Thanks, Emily. It is a very interesting talk. I've learned a lot from it. When I'm listening to your talk, I'm also thinking about a recent book by Jia Li of Harvard University. She talks about what she calls utopian ruins, broken lives, records of famine, abandoned factories, victimhood, treacherous dossiers, which you can still see the traces in China and elsewhere. And here your story is quite different. It is more or less about socialist success as a juxtaposition to her narratives of ruins. I have a couple of questions. How did the leaders deliberate about choosing acupuncture or ping pong, if you will, as a tool? What other alternatives were considered at that time and why they were thrown out? And if we have more knowledge about the process of deliberation, we may know more about why they pick this particular mechanism or commodity, if you will.
Yeah.
Which leads me to the next question. You brought out your analysis on a capitalist socialist axis, right? And it was quite clear that this socialist item can be a capitalist commodity, and how to make that transition and use it as a diplomatic tool is a quite interesting story that you have just told us. What about the imperialist colonial axis? That the reception in the United States of things foreign, whether it is food, dresses, or other items, normally would occupy a niche, exotic, and sometimes inferior position. How does the reception of acupuncture in the United States fit or not fit that story? Thank you.
Thank you. Those are excellent comments and questions. I'm so happy to be able to get feedback on this project. So I feel like I've just been going around in my head with it. Okay, the first question was about how the Chinese leadership chose acupuncture as this tool. And so I unfortunately don't have any direct records that talk about how they made the decision to choose it, but my assumption is that they were actually just kind of throwing things at the wall and seeing what stuck. Because, when I talked about Arthur Galston and Ethan Signer coming into the country, I mean, they were also brought to various laboratories and, departments of biology, and they were shown acupuncture anesthesia, but they were also shown acupuncture as a treatment for hearing loss. And they did write about acupuncture as a treatment for deafness back in the United States. But I think what happened is that acupuncture anesthesia was just so over the top, that it was just so spectacular and theatrical that Americans became very, very interested in it. And so the Chinese government were responding to that interest. So they may not have known ahead of time that this was the thing that Americans were going to really glom onto, but they were actually monitoring reports about acupuncture anesthesia in the United States. And I have seen archival materials where the Ministry of Health will specifically reference like journal articles and newspaper articles that had been published in the United States. And they would say, oh, the Americans at first didn't believe that acupuncture anesthesia worked, and now they believe that it works. So I think in many ways, this was kind of like a two-way process, where at first the Chinese government was throwing a lot out there, and then they began to respond to what the Americans were responding to. In terms of the second question about the reception of things foreign, about how foreign things tend to occupy a sort of inferior position, I think this is exactly what happens with acupuncture. Acupuncture is still not considered part of mainstream medicine. It's considered part of complementary and alternative medicine. And establishment physicians, biomedical physicians, worked very hard through professional organizations like the American Medical Association to ensure that it remained in this inferior position as something that was alternative to biomedicine, but not actually part of mainstream medicine. And so even when they were able to figure out a physiological rationale for it, the endorphins, for instance, were discovered in 1975. And so endorphins were used as a way to explain why acupuncture works. Even after they were able to determine this physiological mechanism for acupuncture, they still kind of kept it on the margins because they would characterize it as something that was very subjective, as something that differed from patient to patient, as something that they couldn't fully explain, notwithstanding the fact that within biomedicine as well, not every treatment works for every patient, not every procedure can be explained, right? So they did continue to marginalize it as something separate, something that wasn't part of the mainstream. but I really liked your framing of this imperialist colonialist axis. So thank you for those comments.
Great. I believe the next hand was Howard.
Hi, Emily. Thank you so much for a fascinating talk. I read a version of the proposal last year, and this is actually quite exciting to hear your the kind of tentative product of your preliminary research on the topic. So I have 3 questions, and I'm going to try to be as succinct as possible. But the first question does follow up on Eddie's last question. Because I think that you're doing a lot of very innovative stuff here in terms of kind of extending the historiography of both medicine and China. And as you said in the presentation, one of, I think, the most striking thing about your project is that it reverses the typical flow of intellectual knowledge that we tend to have in the modern history of medicine in China. So we're looking at, from China expanding outward, in this case, in the context of US, which is, again, sorely needed because there hasn't been a globalization history of acupuncture, especially in the Cold War era, until your work. But I just want to kind of hear your thoughts a bit more on this issue about flow, right? Because I think in the traditional historiography, if you think about the transmission of Western biomedicine to China or to other colonial contexts, the larger narrative is very easy to tell. It's a way to reinforce Western superiority. It's a way to enforce, again, going back to the issue of imperialism. I'm just curious then, what is the larger goal, I guess, of what you're calling needle diplomacy? And so if it's not colonial, and maybe you're not even thinking about like this interesting phrase called cultural development, that might not even fit. So what would be your term? What would be your conceptualization for characterizing the larger goal of this, going from China to the US? And the second point, relatedly, is also about medicine, because you mentioned barefoot doctors, which was actually endorsed by the WHO. I would like to say a bit more about the relationship between Maoism and medicine, because I think, again, this is super fascinating. Intellectual historians have been really interested in the story about global Maoism. Well, China historians have been looking at the social history of the socialist era and beyond, but more to the point, there's been a lot of discussion about the importance of Maoism to the rise of the global left, third world revolutionaries, as well as kind of the way that China has built, establishing its neo-colonial relationships since the 1970s and onwards. So in this case, other historians of medicine, like Xiaoping Feng, has argued that, in fact, quite ironically, barefoot doctors actually bolstered the status of biomedicine in China. I'm just curious, where would you go with this acupuncture story that you're telling? Because on the one hand, it might be a success story for Chinese medicine, but really when we get to somewhere like the US context, you can also see as being compartmentalized once again to an alternative and complementary practice, rather than having some kind of sway over mainstream. Does that make sense? So I'm curious where you stand on that. What comes out of this? Do you agree with Xiaoping? Like this is actually another bolstering of the superiority of Western biomedicine, or actually there's something unique here? And my third question then, relatedly and very quickly, I'm going to shut up very quickly, is actually the question about the body, because I think, interesting enough, the history of acupuncture kind of presumes that the kind of body system that it operates on is different from the body of biomedicine. Like if you look at Hisa Kuriyama's book, that's what, the meridian tract are not the nerves, right? It's kind of the Japanese doctors that mapped the meridian tract onto the nerves that somehow allow acupuncture to modernize, so to speak. So I think it's a bit ironic here too. So is this kind of a story of failure again? That you would think that this would open up discussions about multiple body systems or like different conceptualizing of the body. But if acupuncture gets reduced to alternative status once again, does it actually kind of close up the space for thinking about the body multiple? So I was curious what you think about in relation to the body.
Okay. Oh my gosh. I want to write this down. So just give me 1 second. Thinking about, because I really like how you phrase that, thinking about the body multiple. Okay. So your first question was, what is the larger goal of needle diplomacy? And so I'm thinking about this in terms of kind of 2 registers. One is the history of China as a global actor, and then the other is the history of biomedicine. And so, I've been really inspired by people like Qin Li's concept of global China, where we have to think about, not just thinking about China within the bounds of the nation state, but how can we think about China as a global actor in the same way that Western countries are just sort of taken for granted as global actors, right? But in terms of the history of biomedicine, one of the things that I really want this project to show is that biomedical development is not necessarily culturally insular in the way that we tend to think about it. So when we think about Chinese medicine, we think that it absorbs different influences, right? It certainly absorbs the influence of scientific biomedicine, but when we think about scientific biomedicine, we tend to think about it as just sort of emerging, kind of almost fully formed, that it's set apart from its cultural context. And so what I want to show here is that actually biomedicine can absorb influences from other regions and from other cultures, but that those influences tend to get buried because they often get stripped of the cultural origins from which they came. So for example, like one of the other threads that I'm sort of pursuing in this book looks at the history of changing conceptions of pain within biomedicine. And one of the things that I show is that following the introduction of acupuncture to the United States in the 1970s, popular models of how pain was conceived get completely rethought as a result of biomedical physicians undertaking experiments with acupuncture. And so they themselves wouldn't necessarily attribute the changing of these models to acupuncture, but they were doing experiments with acupuncture, right? And so it kind of signals to me that the way that we think about biomedicine, the development of biomedicine actually was influenced by other conceptual systems and other practices that come from afar, even if those practices aren't integrated wholesale into the Western context. And then, so your other 2 questions had to do with barefoot doctors and how, the system of the body continues to remain separate, right? We have never been able to find a way to integrate the Chinese medical body with the Western medical body. So is that an example of failure? Possibly, but it also could be an example of the history that hasn't quite come to an end. So, okay, so one of the things that I've been looking into recently has been the history of a group of parapsychologists in the 1970s who become really, really interested in acupuncture. And they use acupuncture and a technology called Kirlian photography. Kirlian photography was a way of examining the auras of the body, like the energy flows that was given off by the body. And they used acupuncture and would take Kirlian photographs of individuals who are undergoing acupuncture treatment to show that when someone was needled, their auras would change. It would look different. And they use these examples as a way to try to promote a new paradigm shift in the way that people thought about bodies. And they actually write very explicitly about how, through using acupuncture and through using Kirlian photography, this is a way of blending the biomedical body with the Chinese concept of qi and the Ayurvedic concept of prana. So they were actually trying to push this new idea of bodies that could bring all of these different medical cultures into dialogue with one another. The problem, again, is that the American medical establishment is able to has enough power that it's able to marginalize these voices. And so although they were able to get a lot of publicity in the 1970s, ultimately these voices sort of die out. So I don't know. I mean, it can possibly be thought about as, this is actually one of the things that I've been kind of grappling with in terms of how to frame it, because it can possibly be thought about as a success story in the sense that they are thinking more broadly about how to create an integrationist view of bodies, one that brings all of these different medical cultures into dialogue. But then it's also a failure story because people aren't necessarily taking it seriously and it doesn't go anywhere. So I don't know. I mean, these are really excellent questions, and it's something that I think I need to think about more, but I'm really glad that you've raised them. So thank you.
Great. Great questions. Incredible set of questions. Yeah. Xiaoling.
Yes. Thank you, Emily. A very, very interesting talk. So I'm just following up with Eddie's question about the access with capitalist versus socialist and imperialist versus colonial experience. So have you thought about another dimension? That is, on the surface, it appears to be China, at least from the part of China, they were using uniquely like a cultural character, like a more characteristics of the culture. For example, acupuncture has a long history, and also ping pong that the people were extremely good at, and also panda, and that's so unique, so rare from the country. So they use all those things or cultural characteristic or cultural heritage to do diplomacy. That's on the surface, right? Because those are interesting, innovative, and also successful on the parts of China. But the hidden agenda, and there's I think there's a hidden agenda is it's trying to assert its status or its position in the history or in the world of its civilization, of its tradition. So there's that encounter of tradition versus modernity, because there's the modern medicine. And many Chinese think modern medicine is too mechanical, and 头痛医头，脚痛医脚, that you cure the head when you have a headache, you cure the foot when you have a foot ache. Too simplistic. So the Chinese version of medicine is holistic. It's a totally different view of modern medicine or even modern science. There's some kind of sort of cultural version of what is considered medicine, what is considered health. So it's asserting its position, in its civilization or its cultural heritage. And that's not surprising. Even in this last year, actually currently, the Chinese medical community also are actively pursuing some kind of traditional Chinese medicine cure of COVID symptoms. The country actively promote certain types of combination of cure. So it's just actively promoting an alternative form of so-called medicine or science or even civilization or world order. So that's just my curiosity. Is there a relevance of that dimension, that kind of thinking?
Wait, sorry, could you just say what the question is really quickly? They're promoting a traditional agenda, or
there's that dimension of tradition versus modernity. There's that encounter, and then there is the more traditional vision of the body, the medicine, and versus the modern medicine. So,
it's interesting because at the time in the 1970s, they weren't really promoting acupuncture so much as a traditional medical modality as a revolutionary one, right? Because acupuncture anesthesia was something that had only been developed under Mao. And the reason that it had been developed under Mao is because there was this push to unify Chinese and Western medicine and to find ways to incorporate both of these medical systems into a single, like, an umbrella new medicine, a xinyi, that they referred to it as a new medicine that could be exportable to the entire world, that wasn't just the product of one country or one system. And so under Mao, acupuncture anesthesia wasn't talked about as being like the product of China's 5,000-year-long heritage. It was talked about as being a new revolutionary invention. It was actually only after the end of the Cultural Revolution and with the turn to reform and opening that acupuncture starts to be talked about more and more in China as this cultural legacy and part of this long-standing cultural heritage. And I think, again, I think this sort of goes back to Eddie's point, or the point that I was making in response to Eddie's question, is that the Chinese government and people within the Ministry of Health, they're really watching what foreigners are interested in and what they're attracted to, and are responding to that, right? It's kind of like this dialogue. And so it really wasn't until like after the Maoist era that acupuncture in China really starts to be actively promoted as this cultural legacy, but that wasn't necessarily the case in the Maoist period.
Thank you, Xiaoling. Yeah. So I have a couple of questions, but I want to share a quick story. Actually, you guys are probably too young, but when I was in grad school, CSCC still exists. Maybe Eddie also knew at that time. So actually, I was selected for the interview, flew out in New York City, and then to interview us. We always wonder, why do they need to interview us? They couldn't do otherwise. Obviously, we were told eventually we represent the country, not just ourselves. So your point when you talk about the 中美学术交流会, I thought it was so funny, brought my memory up. But my questions here, the first one has something to do with, I think Howard already touched on that, the tensions between science and ideology. It seems that's one of the really interesting issues here. And not only the tension is handled differently between the West and the China, but it's also evolving, changing over time within China, right then and now. So I wonder whether you would say a little bit more in your project, in your book, about this tension, how that's handled, the science and ideology. And what's the larger implication when we see this evolving relationship over time in China? And the second question has something to do with my own research and kind of echoes with my research on psychotherapy. So I wonder, whether when we think about the flow of acupuncture knowledge in the practice, so maybe beyond the way of thinking about a one-way process or two-way process you mentioned in the beginning, the West and the China, would that be more interesting to think about as a global circuit of flow, the back and forth, the dialogic relationship you mentioned, how China is watching what the West responding to, and then what's practiced later on in the West maybe trickle back to China and influence, reshape what's practiced in China. So I'm very curious. I find it fascinating about this global circuits of knowledge and practice. And so maybe you can, obviously your colleague Mei Zhang's work on TCM, but I think you have a different angle there. So yeah.
I think that's a really interesting point, right? Rather than thinking about global influences in terms of like point A to point B, we can think about this as in a dialogical relationship. And I think like the more that I've been talking in response to your questions, the more I think that that's actually the better model to be thinking about this of, right? It wasn't just China influencing medical developments in the United States, but that people in China were also actively watching what Americans were interested in and responding to that, and it kind of just goes back and forth. So that's a really interesting point. The tensions between science and ideology, the larger implications of that. Sorry, could you re-ask that question? What?
I mean, you don't really need to answer here. I guess in your larger research, I wonder whether you will address that. So beyond the more historical historiography, so on the theoretical level, what do you want to say about the relationship between science and ideology and how that's handled in China also over time, not just China versus West? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. That's interesting. I'll have to think more about that because I haven't really. I haven't really given much of that thought. I mean, I think, with biomedicine, physicians like to think that science is above ideology, that that it's acultural, that it isn't restricted to a particular ideological or cultural system, that it can just exist regardless of time and place. But because of how China has sort of absorbed biomedical influences and how they have, Chinese medicine, biomedicine, and then the two together, the development of medicine in China in the 20th century, I think, has always been a lot more overt about how ideology and science work together.
Yeah. I asked that because I think in anthropology and medical anthropology, there has been a lot of critique of biomedicine and saying biomedicine appear as a universal, apolitical, right? But obviously not. So a lot of anthropologists have been writing about that, Emily Martin, to say biomedicine is actually very much embedded in Western certain ideology and the cultural ideology, and not, stripped of ideology. So it's a different kind of ideology we're talking about. Is that, but anyway, I'm curious, what you're gonna do later on.
I see what you're saying. I think I'm gonna have to give that more thought. But that's a really interesting point.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There's a long question from a student who had to leave, but I will turn to Howard first. Yeah.
Oh, very quickly, sorry, because the discussions that you had after I asked my question actually prompted me to think something else, because, I was kind of thinking about what acupuncture was doing in this history that you're tracing, right? Because if it's acupuncture anesthesia, and that's a misnomer, it seems like, going back to Xiaoling's point, Chinese medical doctors have often critiqued Western medicine for just curing the symptoms, but not getting at its roots, right? That has been something that was reappropriated by Chinese physicians themselves. But in the context of acupuncture or anesthesia, I don't know, acupuncture is not really curing something. it's just relieving the pain. Like, do you see what I'm saying? It's actually not doing some curative work. And from that observation, I'm just curious whether you think that, the object of treatment by acupuncture may have, also changed over time. And I'm asking that question also because, following what you said, for a long time in China, acupuncture actually has been ranked not as high as herbal medicine, medical treatment. So sometimes actually people might even combine them rather than just singling out, acupuncture treatment as something that's very potent on its own. And these days, I think acupuncture is also recommended for like pain relieving. So again, I feel like it's again doing something very not superficial, but it's not doing like very hardcore curative work. So I'm just curious what you think about that.
Yeah, well, I actually think the association between acupuncture and pain is a relatively recent innovation. I mean, if you look at more ancient medical texts about acupuncture, acupuncture was used on a whole host of different disease symptoms or illness patterns, and wasn't necessarily just used to target pain. And I think actually the whole notion that pain is or should be thought about as a standalone medical condition is something that really only arises in the middle of the 20th century after the Second World War, largely as a result of the biomedical revolution and the pharmaceutical revolution, right? People suddenly weren't dying from infectious diseases anymore. Instead, they had aches and pains associated with old age or conditions that biomedicine couldn't treat through pharmaceutics, right? And so it actually is only starting in the second half of the 20th century that acupuncture and pain come to be very closely associated with one another. Prior to that time, acupuncture was used as a sort of cure-all for lots of different illnesses. So,
I think that's very interesting. Like if somehow that story about the pain is so central to needle diplomacy and vice versa, I think that's very interesting.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. I think we'll turn to Eddie for the last question, and then we'll end at about 5:30. I also have to run, so thank you.
Thanks, Lee.
Yeah.
1970 to 71, right? After all, it was still in the Cultural Revolution period. A lot of the practitioners that you mentioned probably were in a precarious position. Zhou Peiyuan, I think you mentioned Zhou Peiyuan, was attacked, and then he became an attacker. Will there be some research within this project to look at that community, which are working with the state, but also fearing about the safety, if not also the family members, but also at the same time knowing that there's something to be gained by working so closely with the state in such an important mission between the United States and China. So I guess the question is whether you will have a community level analysis.
Community level analysis. I think a lot of it has to do with what sources I'm able to access. I mean, kind of the reason that I started doing this project was because I couldn't get into China. And so it ended up being like a kind of global China project from the perspective of the United States. And so I've had some graduate students who are in the PRC who have been able to kind of poke around in different archival sources on my behalf. But it's difficult to say, with me not being able to spend like a concerted amount of time within China, what types of sources to get at that might be accessible. If you have any ideas, I would be very open to hearing suggestions. I don't know if you do.
文史资料.
Oh, the 文史资料. That's actually a good idea. Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Eddie. Thank you, everyone, for coming. But most of all, thank you, Emily, for a wonderful talk and such a stimulating discussion. I really enjoyed it too. And Xiaoling, thank you. Xiaoling, do you have any closing remark?
I will be brief. So thank you, Emily, for a highly stimulating talk, and Lee for your excellent work moderating the session, and everyone for your excellent questions. I enjoyed the discussion a lot, and everybody for coming, attending the talk, and we wish you a wonderful evening.
Thank you so much. Honestly, these questions were really fantastic and have gotten me thinking in lots of different directions, so I really appreciate it.
Yeah, when we have a chance, we look forward to having you here on campus in person.
Awesome.
Please, invite me out.
Yeah, we will wine and dine you.
Okay, well, thank you again, Emily. We'll be in touch, and good night, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.